Some days, working from home starts to feel a little suffocating. And on those days, I like to step outside and find a cafe. Not necessarily the perfect desk, but the right atmosphere. So today I'm taking you to a few cafes in Da Nang where I like to slow down, order a coffee or matcha, and spend a few quiet hours getting things done. you.